series on the patriarchs. As we look through the book of Genesis at the men that God chose to work with throughout that book, we see opportunities for each one of them to overcome a specific failure in their life. As we've already seen with Abraham, God worked with Abraham to overcome weak faith and help him to grow and give him opportunities to become a person known for strong faith. And Abraham took advantage of those opportunities given by God and became a man known as the father of faith. As we move on, we're going to look at some other men in the book of Genesis, starting today with Lot and in the future with Isaac. And we're going to look with these two and how God gives opportunity for us to remedy a failure in our life, but it still remains incumbent upon us to grasp a hold of that opportunity, to take advantage of what God has laid out there. And sadly, we'll see with both of these men that they do not take advantage of the space God gives them, the opportunity God provides for them to remedy their failure. And we will start with Lot. Now, I want to understand who Lot was. We're going to actually have to go back a little bit from where we were last time in our study, because Lot, his story overlaps with that of Abraham. Lot was Abraham's nephew, and he traveled with Abraham for much of Abraham's early journey. When God told Abraham to leave Haran and to go into the land of Canaan, Lot went with him. This shows a trust that Lot had in God, but also in Abraham to lead and guide. And he saw how God worked in Abraham's life. He saw how God led Abraham into the land of Canaan and promised it to him. He saw how God dealt with Abraham when Abraham went to Egypt. And we saw that issue of Abraham lying about Sarah. But Lot was a part of that. He saw that issue and how God was merciful and gracious through there. And we're going to pick up the story when we get into Genesis chapter 13. And because this is the point where they have come back out of Egypt, they're back in the land of Canaan, and issues arise that cause a separation between Abraham and Lot, so that Lot now must stand on his own. And when he stands on his own, we start to see Lot's major failure. The failure that, like all of these men that we're going to talk about, they each had something that was specific to them that God helped them deal with, or attempted to help them deal with. And for Lot, his failure is one of attachment to sin. Lot was one of those people that sin easily grabbed a hold of, and it was hard for Lot to turn away from that temptation. And I think we can see in our own lives many cases where we are tempted, we're drawn away by issues that the devil or our own flesh will throw up, and it wants to pull us away from God. And we become attached to those sins, to those behaviors or habits or things that are leading us away from righteousness. And for Lot, that is definitely his problem. He is attached to sin. And we'll see that as we read in Genesis chapter 13. We'll start with the issue of what caused Abraham and Lot to separate. And so we read this in verse 5 of chapter 13. It says, "And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents, and the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together. For their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray you, between me and you, and between my herdmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself, I pray, from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right, and if you depart to the right, then I will go to the left." So we see the issue comes from God's blessing upon Abraham and Lot, that their herds had grown, their flocks had multiplied, and there was not enough food for these animals in the land of Canaan where they were for them to live together. The land just could not support that many herds because God had blessed them with so much material wealth. And so Abraham says to Lot, we don't need to be arguing. We don't need to be fighting. We're brothers. We're actually uncle and nephew, but we're relatives. We should not have issues in the family that's causing all this problem. So here's what we need to do. We need to separate, and I'm going to give you the choice. If you go this way, I'll go the other way. We'll separate. And Abraham very generously gives Lot the choice of where they go. So Lot's attachment to sin actually begins at this point when he has a choice to make. If we read on in the next few verses, we see the choice that Lot made. In verse 10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, and it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you come unto Zoar. And Lot chose for himself all of the plain of Jordan. And Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward or as far as Sodom. So Lot's attachment to sin begins when he chooses to move towards the cities of the plain. He looks around with natural eyes, and he sees that the land of the Jordan Valley was well watered, that there would be plenty of food for his flocks and his herds, and he says, I'm going to go there. And human wisdom would say, yes, that makes sense. You want to go to where you can support your needs, where all of these things can be taken care of because of how well watered and all the provision that is there in the land. But we must temper our human wisdom, our natural understanding of things. We must temper that with spiritual understanding. And when we read the very next verse after where we left off, we see why there was an issue. Because it says that in verses 11 and 12 that Lot chose the cities of the plain, and he went there even as far as Sodom. But in verse 13 it tells us, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Sodom and Gomorrah, even today, 4,000 years later, the names Sodom and Gomorrah just symbolize evil and depravity and wickedness. And it was known for that in the day of Lot and Abraham as well. Yet Lot still chose to go there, even knowing he would be surrounded by all of this wickedness and all of this evil. He went because it would support his livestock. If he stayed in the land of Canaan, there might be water, there might be food. It wasn't guaranteed. It depended on weather and how that moved through. So he wanted this well-watered, fertile land. Well, that does make sense, but we also, as Christians today, we need to understand we can trust God to provide, even in areas that may not seem naturally provident. God can create providence for us in a difficult land just as easily, and it causes us to trust in God more if we're relying on Him to provide for us. Lot didn't look at it that way. He said, look, there's water here, there's food here for my animals, everything is provided if I go towards the city of the plains, and I don't have to worry about anything else. So he did not need to trust God to provide for things. Instead, he also did not look at the surroundings. He may have looked at positive sides of the surroundings. I mean, the cities of the plain would have been very cosmopolitan. There would have been events. There would have been festivals. There would have been all types of activities to get involved in that were not necessarily bad in and of themselves. But when you're mixing that with the wickedness of the people, then it leads to a problem of association with wickedness, and that wickedness drawing us away from righteousness. So even on the outside, the natural positive things that we can see looking from the outside of provision for his herds, food for himself and his family, events and festivals and things that we would want to be associated with emotionally and having friends and connections. It's things that the desert and Canaan just couldn't offer. But there were negative things that those places offered as well, the wickedness of the people. And so we need to look not just with physical eyes, but with spiritual eyes. And you may say, well, in a sense, he's okay. He's not in the city. He said he pitched his tent toward Sodom. He moved toward the cities of the plain. So he's not in sin. He was just getting close to it. He wasn't in Sodom. He was near Sodom. But we have to understand this is just the first step. And for so many of us, the first step is all it takes. That we may move toward sin, and the next thing we know, we're in sin. Lot moved toward Sodom. He didn't go into it. He moved toward Sodom. But look at what happens the very next time we see Lot. We read through verse 13 in chapter 13, and after that, we don't see Lot again until chapter 14. And halfway through chapter 14, when we get down to verse 12, we find that Lot, it says there, dwelt in Sodom. So in chapter 13, he moved toward Sodom. In chapter 14, he's living in Sodom. Sodom, of course, is symbolizing sin. It's symbolizing wickedness, depravity. And if we move toward sin and wickedness, we will eventually end up in sin and wickedness. The first step is the most dangerous step. If we can avoid the first step, then we'll never get there. If we never take a step towards sin, towards wickedness, towards evil, we'll never end up in wickedness, sin, evil. We will stay separate. This is what James in James chapter 1 refers to when he talks about the nature of sin and how it gets a hold of us. In James chapter 1 verses 14 through 15, he says there, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away by his own lust and enticed. Then when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death." So we see that being drawn away, being enticed, like Lot was enticed by all these good things with the city of the plain, was the first step towards being tangled up in sin. There wasn't anything wrong with the plain being well watered. There wasn't anything wrong with all of the good things that were offered in the cities of the plains, but there were bad things as well. And it was these good things that enticed him and drew him away from Abraham, and thereby drawing him away from God and a relationship with God that Abraham had modeled for him. And so when Lot was drawn away and enticed by what it looked like, he moved toward that sin, and then next thing we know, he's in sin. James says that every man is tempted when he is drawn away by his lust, by his desire, by what looks good and what he wants. And he is enticed by these things. But then when lust has conceived, when the business is done, it brings forth sin. So when we are enticed and drawn away towards issues of wickedness, it will bring forth sin eventually. And sin, when it is completed, brings forth death. This is the goal of Satan. He wants to destroy. We know that he comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. And the way he does it is not to directly hammer down on us. He draws us away, and he tempts us to move away from what we know is righteous and towards what we know is wicked by appearances that are good, things that appear to be positive. But we must look with spiritual eyes at the total package, not just the outward appearance, but look at what is deeper there. Just like it says with God that he does not look on the outward appearance, but on the thoughts and intents of the heart, we need to look at decisions that we make with those same eyes, not just on the outward appearance of how does it look in the natural, but look deeper into the heart of the matter. Is there goodness in that heart, or is there wickedness in that heart? And definitely for Sodom, there was wickedness in that. So we need to be careful, and just like Lot could have done, if he had chosen to go the other way, he never would have ended up in Sodom. If we can prevent the first step, we'll never end up there. We'll never end up in a problem if we stop it the first time. We see this throughout the Bible. We find in Proverbs where the writer in the early chapters is trying to instruct his son about how to live a righteous life. And he talks about being drawn away by adultery. And he talks about a woman of the evening, a woman of the night. And he says, don't even go to that street in Proverbs. He says nothing about don't commit adultery with the woman. He says, don't even go to the street. Don't go to where she lives, because you know you'll be drawn away. You know you'll be enticed into that situation. We see this as a principle that is laid out for us if we will only follow it. If we will only trust God to provide for us in what may not seem in the natural as positive a situation, but spiritually has greater benefits than other places, other opportunities, we can trust God, we can avoid the first step towards sin and not end up in sin. So Lot messed that up. He took his first step. He moved toward the cities of the plain. He moved toward Sodom and ended up in Sodom. But God is faithful to Lot to provide him an opportunity to change, to try again. And I'm so thankful that God is the same way with us, that he gives us opportunity to try again. When we make a mistake, he doesn't just immediately rain destruction down upon us. He's a merciful and loving God, and he will gently and tenderly draw us back to him and try to get us to choose wisely, to choose righteously, to choose God rather than to choose wickedness and evil and sin. And God does that for Lot. He is faithful to give him a second opportunity. Now, it may not originally appear like mercy from God because it comes in the form of Lot being captured by an invading army. But Lot was captured by an invading army, and it got him out of Sodom. Lot wasn't going to leave Sodom on his own. He'd been drawn away. He'd been enticed. He was in there. So God has this invading army come in and capture Lot and take him away. So he is forcibly removed from Sodom. We read this in Genesis chapter 14. At the start of the chapter, it talks about all these different kings. There was a group of one set of kings who fought against a group of another set of kings. And one of the king groups that they were fighting against included the city of Sodom. So when the first set was victorious in the battle, they captured all of the people and the goods and the property, the cattle and the herds and all the wealth of these other cities. And when they conquered and captured the wealth of Sodom, and we read this in chapter 14, verse 11, they took Lot too. It says they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions, and they went away. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So God's faithfulness to Lot is shown by having him captured by this invading army and taken out of Sodom, removed from the sin he had gotten himself into. How often does God do that for us? We will mess things up and we'll get ourselves into trouble, get entangled in sin, and God is so merciful to find a way to drag us back out of that and pull us out of the sin that we've wrapped ourselves up in. And it may not look like a positive thing. It may look like an invading army has captured us. But if we will look with spiritual eyes, we will see the mercy and the graciousness of God in taking us out of the situation we've ended up in and giving us a new start. Because after Lot is captured and taken away by this invading army, Abraham finds out about it. And Abraham gathers his own little army together. And with the support of God and the direction of God, Abraham goes and chases down this army of invaders that has captured Lot and rescues Lot. Not just Lot, but rescues all of the captives that were taken away, brings back all of their provisions. Nothing is lost. All of the goods and all of the cattle and herds and people that this army had captured were recovered by Abraham under the direction of God. When we read this in verse 16, it says, and he, Abraham, brought back all of the goods and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods and the women and all of the people. So Abraham manages to save Lot from this situation. Notice what God has done. God used one army to get Lot out of Sodom. And then he brought a righteous man in to rescue Lot and bring him back to a start-over point. How gracious is God to do that for Lot and for us? that God can bring us out of something we've gotten into, and then he will put somebody in our place, like Abraham was for Lot. Maybe some older saint or a friend or someone who is living in right relationship with God, who can come in and help us, who can show us the way and give us a fresh start in the situation. And that's what happens here, because as they're returning back, after Abraham rescues Lot, they stop by the city of Salem, which is an old name for Jerusalem. And there is a priest king named Melchizedek. He is the king of Salem. He is also the priest of Salem, and he knows God. He is a worshiper of God, just like Abraham is. And Abraham demonstrates for Lot how we live in relationship with God through his interactions with Melchizedek. Melchizedek standing as a representative of God, the priest of God. So that Abraham gives a tithe, or 10% of the goods that were restored, he gives to Melchizedek as a giving it to God, to the priest of God. We find this in the last part of chapter 14. And so Abraham is demonstrating for Lot an attitude of thankfulness, that when God does something wonderful in our life, we should show gratitude and we should show obedience to God, as Abraham does here. By giving these tithes, he's worshiping God, thanking God for the blessings that God brought into his life by allowing him to rescue his nephew. We also see how Abraham gives to God and to a righteous king, Melchizedek, who is representing God, but he will not receive from evil. Starting in verse 21, we read in chapter 14, it says, "The king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the people, and you take the goods for yourself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoelace, that I will not take anything that is yours, unless you would say, I have made Abraham rich. Only except that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion." So Abraham has this opportunity that the king of Sodom says, look, you can have all the goods, just let me have my people back. Many of us would have jumped on that. We would have said, yes, I can get rich here. I can get some possessions. But Abraham knew that these things were tainted by the sin of Sodom, that these were wicked goods that had been gained in wicked ways, and that it would also tie him to Sodom, that if he took this wealth from the king of Sodom, then the king of Sodom would have a connection, a tie to Abraham, a little bit of power over Abraham, that the king of Sodom could have said, yes, Abraham is wealthy because I gave him all these goods. Abraham would no longer be able to say, I have what I have because God has blessed me with it. In a sense, if he had taken these goods, it would have destroyed his witness for God. This again goes back to looking at things with spiritual eyes. We need to be careful that when opportunities come into our life, we look at them with spiritual eyes and look at the greater repercussions that can take place if we go down certain roads. Would I be tied to sinful people? Would sinful people be able to say they have control over some issue of my life? Would I be able to be as effective a witness for God if I did this or if I did that? We need to look at these things with spiritual eyes. And Abraham demonstrates for Lot that spiritual vision of looking at the situation, and he tells the king of Sodom, look, I'm not taking anything from you. I won't even take a shoelace from you. I don't want anything that you can say you gave me wealth. He said, now the other people who went with me, that's their call. That's their decision. Let them have their portion, but I'm not taking anything from you. We need to have the boldness to stand there in situations in our life, and even if we're standing alone, say, whatever other people do, that's their decision, but I'm going to follow my relationship with God. You know, Abraham witnesses that. He says, I've lifted up my hand to the God of heaven that I'm not going to take anything. He said, I made a vow, I made a promise, and I'm going to live according to that promise. I'm not going to take anything that is tainted by wickedness. So Abraham did this as an example for Lot. He also is an example for us and how we can live our life. So if we go back to focusing on Lot in this story, we see that God brought him out of the sin he had gotten himself into. He chose poorly. He made a mistake. We all make mistakes. Lot made the mistake of going toward Sodom, and he ends up in Sodom. Very often we will make the mistake of going towards sin and ending up in sin. God is faithful to get him out of that. He sends in an invading army and pulls him out of Sodom. God will send in something in our life that will force us out of the situation we've been in. It may look like being sent to jail. It may look like losing a relationship. It may look like a physical illness. There can be all types of ways that on the outside may seem negative when God allows them to come into our life. But if we again look with spiritual eyes, we can see the positive benefits of it in that God may use these actions, these opportunities to pull us out of situations that we've been in that will bring us back to a starting point. Just like he got Lot out of Sodom, brought him back to a position with Abraham, has Abraham demonstrate for Lot ways to live in right relationship with God, worshiping him through giving to Melchizedek, avoiding entanglements of sin with Sodom and the king thereof. He shows him the right way. But it then becomes Lot's choice again. We have to understand God is never going to force us to choose right. God will put the choice before us, and then we must make that choice ourselves. We must decide, am I going to follow God, or am I going to follow what I see with my natural eyes? Am I going to look for spiritual provision, or am I going to look for natural provision? It becomes our decision. If we look in many other places in the Bible, we see that. In the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy, as the children of Israel are about to go into the promised land. And then later on with Joshua, he says, I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life. Notice God says, here's the options. I'm presenting you with these options, but you must make the choice which way you're going to go. Are you going to go for life and blessings, or are you going to go for death and cursings? Even in the New Testament, we see how the rich young ruler came to Jesus and said, what do I have to do to have eternal life? And Jesus told him, here are the things that you have to do, and also you need to follow me. You need to give up all of these other things that are entangling you, and you need to follow me. Jesus laid out the choice. The young ruler had the opportunity to give up things and follow Jesus, but instead it says he went away sorrowful because he was tied to his many possessions. Again, the choice is there. What are we going to choose? Lot is brought back to a new position and now must choose. Am I going to go and live with Abraham again, or in another part of Canaan, or am I going to go back to Sodom? And as we read through the story, we find out Lot goes back to Sodom. Even though God brought him out of all of this entanglement, Lot still chose and was enticed and drawn away again and went back to the very problem that God had brought him out of. That is sadly the case for many of us, that we keep going back. The Bible says, like a dog returning to its vomit, or a sow to wallowing in the mud. We keep going back to the things God brings us out of. God is merciful, God is faithful, give us opportunity, but it remains our choice what we do with it. And are we going to choose right, or are we going to choose wrong? No one can make that choice but us. So what I hope we've seen so far in this first half of the story of Lot, we're going to talk more about him in our next lesson, is the true blessing it is to have a merciful and gracious God who, even when we choose poorly, even when we make a mistake, gives us opportunity to try again. let us not be like Lot, who went back to Sodom. Let us choose right. And if we make a mistake and God gives us an opportunity to try again, let's learn from that. Let's look at examples of people around us, like Lot could have looked at Abraham. And let's learn from it and choose right. Choose righteousness. Choose God. That's what we hopefully see as an example here. Lot showed us a negative example of what we should not do. And we can learn many things from negative examples. And I hope that that is what we see today, is that we know what not to do. That when God gives us a new opportunity, a new chance, we will correct our behavior and we will choose life. We will choose right. As we go on next time, we're going to finish the story of Lot. So if you want to read Genesis chapters 18 and 19, that will get us into the remaining part of Lot's story, and we'll see how God continues to deal with Lot and Lot's attachment and entanglement with sin at that point. So thank you, and have a good evening.